OMG! I was sitting in the Nordstrom bathroom stall and had just sat down when a voice in the next stall over said, "Hi, how are you?" Embarrassed, I said, "I'm fine." The voice continued, "So what are you up to?" I said, "Just sitting here like you." Then the voice says, "Can I come over?" Thoroughly annoyed and somewhat alarmed at this point, I said, "Sorry, I'm kind of busy right now." Suddenly the voice says loudly, "Sorry, I'm going to have to call you back. There's some idiot next to me answering all my questions." At my granddaughter's wedding, the DJ polled the guests to see who had been married longest. It turned out to be my husband and I. The DJ asked us, "What advice would you give to the newly married couple?" I said, "The 3 most important words in a marriage are, 'You're probably right.'" Everyone then looked at my husband and he said, "She's probably right." A lawyer, an environmentalist, and a teacher were going to the bathroom. The lawyer gets done, washes his hands and uses the entire roll of tissue paper to wipe his hands. "I was taught to be thorough," he said. The environmentalist washes his hands and uses his own kerchief to wipe his hands. "I was taught to be environment-friendly," he said. The teacher walks out without washing his hands. "I was taught not to piss on my hands," he says. A man has to go to the bathroom. He enters and finds the only stall occupied. He waits around for a few minutes, but the occupant doesn't move. He knocks on the door and asks, "Hey, buddy, sorry, but I really gotta go. Are you going to be long in there?" The person inside replies with a thick accent, "What? Sorry, I don't understand. My English is not very good." "European?" says the man. "No," replies the one inside. "Imma The new family in the neighborhood overslept and little Johnny missed his school bus. The father, though late for work himself, had to drive him. Since he did not know the way, he said that he would have to direct him to the school. They rode several blocks before he told him to turn the first time, several more before he indicated another turn. This went on for 20 minutes. But when they finally reached the school, it proved to be only a short distance from their home. The father, much annoyed, asked Johnny why he'd led him around in such a circle. Johnny explained, "That's the way the school bus goes, Daddy. It's the only way I know." An elderly couple was sitting at the kitchen table on the morning of their 50th wedding anniversary. "You know," she said, "we were probably sitting in the kitchen across from each other 50 years ago." "Yeah," he said, "but we were probably So let's get now," she suggested. So they both took off all their clothes and sat across from each other. "You know," she said, smiling lovingly, "my feel just as hot looking at you today as they did 50 years ago." He replied, "I'm sure they are. One is in your coffee and the other's in your oatmeal." Kidnapper. "On the phone we have your son." Wife. "Actually, I'm holding my son." Kidnapper. Getting frustrated, then who the heck just asked for chocolate milk with a straw and made us cut the crust off his PB&J? Wife. "Oh God." Kidnapper. "What? Wife? You have my husband." I told my son, "You will marry the girl I choose." He said, "No." I told him, "She is Bill Gates' daughter." He said, "Okay." I called Bill Gates and said, "I want your daughter to marry my son. Bill Gates said, "No." I told Bill Gates, "My son is the CEO of World Bank." Bill Gates said, "Okay." I called the president of World Bank and asked him to make my son the CEO. He said, "No." I told him, "My son is Bill Gates' son-in-law." He said, "Okay." This is how politics works. Last night, my wife suddenly said to me, "You know what? I want you to treat me like you did before we got married." I raised an eyebrow but thought, all right, challenge accepted. So I grabbed my car keys and said, "Let's go." First, I took her to a nice restaurant where we had dinner, just like the old days. We laughed, reminisced, and had some good conversation. On the way home, I even stopped and got her some ice cream, her favorite. She was all smiles, clearly enjoying the evening. But then, as we were driving, I pulled up in front of her parents' house, leaned over, opened the door, and said, "All right, sweetheart, here you go." A woman was caught with drugs in her hand by a cop while in the bathroom of a nightclub. The woman swears that the drugs are not hers and promises that "they aren't mine. I found them here and I tried to flush them down the toilet. However, every single time I flush the drugs down the drain, they just keep reappearing magically in my hands or my pockets." The cop, obviously in disbelief, tells the woman, "Show me." So the woman tosses the bag of drugs into the toilet, then flushes it. The bag swishes down. The cop then stares at the woman's empty hand as the bag is flushed down. "Well," says the cop, "where are the drugs now?" "What drugs?" A mother is helping her son study for a geography test. She asks him, "What is the capital of Germany?" "Berlin," says the boy. "What is the capital of France?" "Berlin," says the boy. "What is the capital of Russia?" "Berlin," says the boy. "Good job, Adolf. You'll do great on your test tomorrow." Little Johnny's parents felt really horny at 11 a.m. on Sunday and wanted to make love, but had to get Johnny away for at least 1 hour. So they told him to go to the balcony and report all the activities of their neighbors for the next hour. Being the innocent, dutiful son he was raised to be, he did as he was told. His parents amused themselves, and then came the formality of the report at 12 p.m. Johnny said, for the past hour the Wilsons were watching TV. Mr. Cole was playing the piano. The Johnsons were playing carom together, and the Donalds were having His parents were shocked. They asked Johnny, "How do you know that?" He said, "Their son was out on the balcony too." A wife sees her husband furiously cleaning the kitchen. She asks, "What are you doing?" Husband replies, "I gotta rub everything down. I just saw a cockroach crawl all over the kitchen." The wife nods and walks away. Later she goes on and posts a thread. "Help! How to catch a cockroach fast. My in-laws are coming, and I need to put one in the bathroom ASAP." A woman marries the man of her dreams, but on their wedding night, he insists on keeping the lights off and staying under the sheets. She finds it a little odd, but assumes he's just shy and doesn't think much of it. Over the next 30 years, they build a beautiful life together. They buy a house, get a dog, and raise 3 wonderful children. But there's one thing that still bothers her. Her husband always insists on keeping the lights off at night. One evening, curiosity finally gets the best of her. Determined to figure out why, she hides a flashlight under her pillow. Just as things get cozy, she suddenly throws back the sheets and shines the light. To her shock, she discovers something completely unexpected. Furious and feeling betrayed, she starts yelling, "How could you keep this from me for 30 years? I trusted you. I feel like such a fool." Her husband sighs, waits for her to finish, and calmly says, "I'll explain this if you explain the kids." I walked into a doctor's office and the receptionist asked me what was wrong. I replied, "Shingles." She took down my name, address, and insurance information and asked me to have a seat. 15 minutes later, a nurse's aide approached and asked the same question. I said, "Shingles." She recorded my height, weight, and complete medical history before directing me to the examination room. Half an hour later, a nurse entered and inquired again what I had. I responded, "Shingles." She proceeded to give me a blood test, check my blood pressure, perform an electrocardiogram, and then instructed me to remove all my clothes and wait for the doctor. About an hour later, the doctor walked in and found me sitting patiently in the He asked, "So what exactly do you have?" I answered, "Shingles." The doctor then asked, "Where are they located?" I replied with a grin, "Out on the truck. Where do you want me to unload them?" On their way home from a night out, two women suddenly needed to use the bathroom. With no other options, they decided to stop at a graveyard. Realizing they had nothing to wipe with, the first woman shrugged, took off her panties and used them. The second woman, looking around, grabbed a wreath from a nearby grave and used that. The next morning, one of their husbands called the other and said, "That's it, no more girls' nights out. My wife came home with no pants." The other husband sighed. "That's nothing. Mine came home with a card stuck in her crack that said, 'From all of us at the fire station, we will never forget you.'" The doctor had a simple policy: a $50 fee for any treatment, regardless of the ailment. However, if he failed to find a cure, he would compensate the patient with $500. One day, a man visited the doctor and said, "Doctor, I think my sense of taste is deteriorating." The doctor handed him a jar. "Take a spoonful of this." The man took a taste, immediately spat it out, and exclaimed, "This is shaving foam. Why would you give this to a patient?" The doctor smiled. "Well, your sense of taste seems just fine. That'll be $50. 2 weeks later, the same man returned. "Doctor, I think I'm developing Alzheimer's." The doctor handed him another jar. "Take a spoonful of this." The man frowned. "Wait a second, this is shaving foam again." The doctor nodded. "Ah, so your memory is perfectly intact. That'll be $50, eh?" A couple of months later, the man returned once more, looking determined. "Doctor, I've lost my eyesight. Please help me." The doctor sighed. "I'm afraid I don't have a cure for that. Here's $500. She's stuck." The man grinned, finally having outsmarted the doctor, until he glanced at the money and blurted out, "Wait, this is only $5. The doctor shook his head. "Well, it seems your eyesight is just fine. That'll be $50. A man and a little Johnny enter a barber shop together. After the man received the full treatment, shave, shampoo, manicure, haircut, etc., he placed Johnny in the chair. "I'm going to buy a green tie to wear for the parade," he said. "I'll be back in a few minutes." When the boy's haircut was completed and the man still hadn't returned, the barber said, "Looks like your daddy's forgotten all about you." "That wasn't my daddy," said Johnny. "He just walked up, took me by the hand and said, 'Come on, son, we're gonna get a free haircut.'" Little Johnny wants his toy, so he walks up to his mother and says, "Mom, give me my toy." His mother responds by saying, "What are the magic words?" So Johnny says the magic words, and his mom gives him his toy. The next day, Johnny starts kindergarten. At snack time, Johnny wants some juice, so he walks up to his teacher and asks for a juice box. The teacher says, "What are the magic words?" So Johnny says the magic words. But the teacher gets upset and calls the little boy's mother and asks her to come in. When the three of them are sitting in the room together, the teacher asks the mother, "Have you been teaching your son sarcasm?" "No," the mother says. "Why? What did he do?" "Well, he asked for a juice box," said the teacher, "and I asked him to say the magic words, and instead of saying please, he said, 'You're thin and you're beautiful.'" A nursery school teacher was delivering a station wagon full of kids home one day when a fire truck zoomed past. Sitting in the front seat of the fire truck was a Dalmatian dog. The children started discussing what the dog's duties might be. "They use him to keep the crowds back," said one youngster. "No," said another, "he's just for good luck." Little Johnny concluded, "No, silly, you're both wrong. They use the dog to find the fire hydrant." The shipwrecked mariner had spent several years on a deserted island. Then one morning he was thrilled to see a ship offshore, and a smaller vessel pulling out toward him. When the boat grounded on the beach, the officer in charge handed the marooned sailor a bundle of newspapers and told him, "The captain said to read through these and let us know if you still want to be rescued." The standard railroad gauge in the US is 4 feet 8.5 inches. This seemingly odd measurement has a fascinating history. English influence. The first US railroads were designed by English engineers who used the same gauge as in England. Wagon tramways. The English built their rail lines using the same gauge as wagon tramways. Tool reuse. The builders of tramways used the same tools and jigs for wagons, which had the same wheel spacing. Old roads. Wagons had to match the wheel spacing of old rutted roads in England to avoid breaking wheels. Roman roads. These rutted roads were originally built by Imperial Rome for their legions. Chariot ruts. Roman war chariots created the initial ruts, setting the standard wheel spacing. Standard gauge? Thus, the US standard railroad gauge is derived from the specifications for Roman war chariots. Space Shuttle twist. The Space Shuttle's solid rocket boosters, OSRBs, were designed to fit through a tunnel on the way to the launch site. The tunnel's width was determined by the railroad track, which is based on the gauge set by Roman chariots. Therefore, a major design feature of the Space Shuttle was influenced by the width of 2 horses' behinds. Ancient decisions continue to impact modern engineering. 4 friends spent months planning the ultimate girls' getaway trip. Shopping sprees, a weekend at the casinos, relaxing massages, and rejuvenating facials. Just 2 days before departure, Susan's husband put his foot down and declared that she wasn't going. Susan's friends were devastated that she couldn't join them, but what could they do? Fast forward to the day of their arrival at the hotel, and to their surprise, they found Susan already at the bar, sipping a fancy cocktail. "Wow, how did you manage to get away?" one friend exclaimed. "And how long have you been here?" Susan grinned. "I've been here since last night. You won't believe how I convinced my husband to let me come. So picture this. Yesterday evening, I was lounging on the couch when he stuck up behind me and covered my eyes, saying, 'Guess who?' I pulled his hands away and found him wearing nothing but his bathrobe. He took my hand and led me to our bedroom, which smelled like roses and had 24 candles lit everywhere. There were rose petals scattered all over the place, and on the bed was a little surprise waiting for me. With a mischievous glint in her eye, she continued, "He told me to get ready for a fun evening. And once I did, he said, 'Now you can have some fun.' So here I am, living my best life." The friends burst into laughter, clinking their glasses. "Looks like we found the ultimate girls' trip after all." My neighbour, Sam, has always been a bit of a mystery. He's single, charming, and has a smile that could light up the whole block. He lives just across the street, and I often see him coming and going in his vintage car, always looking like he's up to something interesting. This evening, just as I was winding down after work, I noticed him walking toward my house. I wondered what was up as he came right up to my door and knocked. When I opened the door, he grinned and said, "Hey, I just got home and realized it's the perfect night to let loose, have a few drinks, and really enjoy myself. Are you free?" I couldn't help but smile at the invitation. "Absolutely," I replied. "Count me in." "Awesome," he said. "Could you take care of my cat for me?" Little Johnny, just 6 years old, came home from school looking a bit red in the face. He had his very first family planning lesson that day, and his mom couldn't wait to hear all about it. "How did it go, Johnny?" she asked, eager for the details. Johnny sighed dramatically. "I was so embarrassed, Mom," he said. "Oh dear," she replied, trying not to laugh. "Why was that?" "Well, Annie from across the street says babies come from storks. Sally, who lives next door, says you can just buy babies at the orphanage. And Timmy from my class says you get babies at the hospital." His mom chuckled. "But that's nothing to be embarrassed about, is it?" Johnny sighed again, this time with a touch of exasperation. "No, Mom, but I didn't have the heart to tell them that you and Dad were so broke you had to make me yourselves." The fancy watch and heavy suitcases. Jake was lugging 2 massive suitcases through a bustling bus station when a stranger approached him. "Got the time?" the stranger asked. With a weary sigh, Jake set down his bags, glanced at his wrist and replied, "It's 6:15. The stranger's eyes widened. "Wow, that's some impressive watch you have there." Jake brightened up a bit and said, "Oh, you haven't seen anything yet?" He tapped a button, and suddenly the display showed the time in every time zone around the world. Another button, and a voice announced, "The time is 6:11." Jake explained. It even uses different regional accents for each city. And the display? Unbelievably sharp, right? The voice quality is incredible too. The stranger was awestruck. "But wait, there's more," Jake said with a grin, tapping another button. A miniature map of New York City appeared, complete with a flashing dot marking their location via satellite. "See? Real-time location tracking." "I have to buy this watch," the stranger exclaimed. Jake shook his head. "Oh, it's not for sale. Still working out some bugs, but check this out." He proceeded to show off the watch's FM radio, a sonar device measuring up to 125 meters, a pager with a thermal printout, and even a voice recorder with enough space to store 300 full-length audiobooks. The stranger was sold. "I don't care. I need this watch. I'll pay you $1,000. No, you don't understand," Jake replied, shaking his head. $5,000, the stranger insisted. Jake hesitated. "Fine, $15,000. The stranger whipped out his checkbook and started writing, his hand shaking with excitement. Jake thought it over. He had only invested about $8,500 into the watch, and with $15,000, he could build another one and maybe even start mass production. The stranger thrust the check into his hand, sealing the deal. "All right, it's yours," Jake said, handing over the watch. The stranger practically skipped away in excitement, but Jake called after him. "Hey, don't forget your batteries!" He pointed to the two massive suitcases. "They power the watch." My wife was in the kitchen wearing only the t-shirt she slept in, preparing our usual soft-boiled eggs and toast for breakfast. As I walked in, almost awake, she turned to me and said softly, "You've got to make love to me right now, right here." My eyes lit up and I thought, I am either still dreaming or this is going to be my lucky day. Roar! Not wanting to lose the moment, I embraced her and then gave it my all, right there on the kitchen table. Afterwards, she said, "Thanks," and returned to the stove. Her t-shirt still around her neck. Happy but still a little puzzled, I asked, "What was that all about?" She explained, "The egg timer's broken." A king had 10 wild dogs. He used them to torture and kill any minister that misguided him. A minister once gave an opinion which was wrong, and which the king didn't like at all. So he ordered that the minister to be thrown to the dogs. The minister said, "I served you loyally 10 years and you do this." The king was unrelenting. Minister pleaded, "Please give me 10 days before you throw me to the dogs." The king agreed. In those 10 days, the minister went to the keeper of the dogs and told him he wanted to serve the dogs for the next 10 days. The guard was baffled, but he agreed. So the minister started feeding the dogs, caring for them, washing them, providing all sorts of comfort for them. So when the 10 days were up, the king ordered that the minister be thrown to the dogs as sentenced. When he was thrown in, everyone was amazed at what they saw. The dogs were wagging their tails, playing with the condemned minister, licking his feet. The king was baffled at what he saw. "What happened to the dogs?" He growled. The minister then said, "I served the dogs for only 10 days, and they didn't forget my service. Yet I served you for 10 years, and you forgot all at the first mistake." The king realized his mistake and replaced the dogs with crocodiles. A married man found himself captivated by a stunning woman and agreed to spend the night with her, settling on a payment of $500 for her company. However, as the night drew to a close, he felt underwhelmed by the experience and decided the price was too steep for what he had received. Rather than paying in cash, they agreed he would send a check labeled as apartment rent to keep things discreet. But still dissatisfied, he chose to send only $250, along with a letter explaining why. "Dear Madam, enclosed is a check for $250, which I am sending as rent for the apartment. I am withholding the remaining amount because when I rented the space, I had certain expectations. I anticipated a vacant unit, a warm and inviting atmosphere, and a comfortable setting. However, what I found was an apartment that had clearly been occupied before, lacked proper heating, and was far too spacious for my liking." Upon receiving the letter and the reduced payment, the woman was unimpressed. She immediately returned the check with a sharp response. "Dear sir, I am quite surprised that you expected such a desirable apartment to remain vacant indefinitely. Regarding the heating issue, it is fully functional. You simply need to know how to turn it on. As for the size, it is indeed ample and well furnished. If you found it lacking, the fault does not lie with the landlord. However, if I do not receive the full $500 as originally agreed, I will be left with no choice but to inform your current landlord." The man never expected such a bold reply, nor the consequences that could follow. My wife and I were in bed watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I turned to her and said, "Do you want to have some fun?" "No," she replied. I grinned and asked, "Is that your final answer?" She didn't even look at me this time, just said, "Yes." "Well then, I'll phone a friend." And that's when the fight began. I took my wife to a restaurant, and for some reason, the waiter took my order first. "I'll have the rump steak. Rare, please." He raised an eyebrow and said, "Aren't you worried about mad cow disease?" I replied, "Nah, she can order for herself." And that's when the fight began. At our high school reunion, my wife kept staring at a drunken man sitting alone at a table. I asked, "Do you know him?" "Yes," she sighed. "He's my ex. After we broke up, he turned to drinking. And I hear he hasn't sobered up since." I said, "Wow, who would have thought someone could celebrate that long?" And that's when the fight started. When our lawnmower broke, my wife kept hinting I should get it fixed. But I always had something more pressing, like working on the shed, fixing the boat, or brewing beer. Finally, she found a clever way to get me to pay attention. I came home one day to find her sitting in the tall grass, cutting it with tiny sewing scissors. I stood there watching her for a minute, then went inside. A minute later, I came back out with a toothbrush and said, "When you finish with the grass, you might as well clean the driveway. The doctors say I'll walk again, but I'll always have a limp." My wife sat down next to me as I was flipping channels. She asked, "What's on TV?" I said, "Dust." And that's when the fight started. On a Saturday morning, I got up early, packed my lunch, and quietly hooked the boat to the van. I drove out into a storm, but when I checked the weather on the radio, I realized it was going to be bad all day. I backed the van into the garage, undressed quietly, and slipped back into bed. I cuddled up to my wife and whispered, "The weather is awful outside." She groggily replied, "And can you believe my idiot husband is out fishing in that?" And that's when the fight started. For our anniversary, my wife hinted at wanting something shiny that could go from 0 to 150 in 3 seconds. So I bought her a bathroom scale, and that's when the fight started. After retiring, I went to the Social Security office to apply for benefits. The lady asked for my driver's license, but I realized I left my wallet at home. I apologized and said I'd have to come back. She said, "Unbutton your shirt." I revealed my silver chest hair and she nodded. "That'll do," she said, and processed my application. When I got home, I told my wife the story and she said, "You should have dropped your pants. You might have qualified for disability too." And that's when the fight started. My wife stood in front of the mirror, looking upset. I feel awful. I'm old, fat, and ugly. "I really need a compliment," she said. I looked at her and replied, "Your eyesight is almost perfect." And that's when the fight started. I rear-ended a car this morning, and it turned into a really bad day. The driver got out, and he was a dwarf. He looked up at me and said, "I am not happy." I answered, "Well, which one are you then?" And that's when the fight started. One year, I bought my mother-in-law a cemetery plot for Christmas. The next year, I didn't get her anything. When she asked why, I said, "Well, you still haven't used the gift I got you last year." And that's when the fight started. An elderly woman went to the store to buy some cat food. She picked up 3 cans, but the cashier stopped her, saying, "I'm sorry, but we can't sell this to you unless you prove you own a cat. Some seniors have been buying cat food for themselves, so we need to make sure it's for your pet." Unfazed, the woman went home, brought her cat back to the store, and was able to purchase the food. The next day, she returned to buy 2 cans of dog food. Again, the cashier requested proof. So the woman went home, fetched her dog, and returned, successfully completing her purchase. On the 3rd day, the woman came back with a small box that had a hole in the lid. She handed it to the cashier and said, "Would you mind sticking your finger inside?" The cashier hesitated, saying, "What if there's a snake in there?" The woman reassured her, "I promise there's nothing in there that could harm you." Reluctantly, the cashier put her finger in the hole, then quickly pulled it out, exclaiming, "That's disgusting." With a grin, the elderly woman replied, "Glad you agree. Now, can I buy 2 rolls of toilet paper, please?"